Hi, my name is Jerry Kroth. I'm a professor in California. This is a new book just published in 2020. Ecocide, Radical Interventions Are Needed Now to Stop Climate Apocalypse. This is a short book. It's a radical book. It is kind of a depressing book, and it is an absolutely necessary read. I'm a psychologist with a PhD, so I don't know a lot of things about climate science. I had to have a lot of the science vetted so that I didn't make any mistakes. And I'm acting kind of as a scientific journalist in writing this book, which is going to scare the daylights out of you. There is a little hope at the end. So let us begin. This talk parallels the book. Chapter 1 is called Despair. Worse than you think and worse than you can imagine. And that is a very apt title if you looked at all the science that is current as of 2019. So let's get started. 3 billion birds have left North America since 1970. Total animal populations have declined 60% since 1970. Flying insects have declined 75%. Bees, ants, and beetles declined 8 times faster than mammals. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. 90% of frogs have disappeared since 1970. This is called the frog apocalypse. Beavers, crocodiles, giant turtles, and sturgeon have fallen 88% since 1970. There have been huge die-offs of animals related to climate change. Saiga in Central Asia had a bacteria in their tonsils for years, but the humidity rose and that bacteria proliferated, and there were like 250,000 carcasses all over Kazakhstan. There have been die-offs of whales and reindeer and dolphins and elephants and moose all over the planet. Here's Greta Thunberg pleading for her generation.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I'm 16 years old. I come from Sweden, and I want you to panic. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, and the extinction rate is up to 10,000 times faster than what is considered normal, with up to 200 species becoming extinct every single day. Erosion of fertile topsoil, deforestation of our great forests, toxic air pollution, loss of insects and wildlife, the acidification of our oceans. These are all disastrous trends being accelerated by a way of life that we, here in our financially fortunate part of the world, see as our right to simply carry on. But hardly anyone knows about these catastrophes or understand how they are just the first few symptoms of climate and ecological breakdown. Because how could they? They have not been told. Or more importantly, they have not been told by the right people and in the right way. Our house is falling apart, and our leaders need to start acting accordingly. Because at the moment they are not. If our house was falling apart, our leaders wouldn't go on like you do today. You would change almost every part of your behavior, as you do in an emergency. If our house was falling apart, you wouldn't fly around the world in business class chatting about how the market will solve everything with clever small solution. You wouldn't talk about buying and building your way out of a crisis that has been created by buying and building things. You wouldn't hold 3 emergency Brexit summits and no emergency summit regarding the breakdown of the climate and environmental.
So When we review the science, it's where do you start? Heat records are being broken left, right, and center. 11 of the past 12 years have been the hottest recorded since 1850. The hottest month ever recorded was June 2019, but then they had to revise that to July 2019. Paris had the hottest temperature ever recorded, 114 degrees this summer, 2019. For the last 42 years, global temperatures have exceeded their long-term averages. So obviously that's a trend, a statistical trend that goes back all that time. One scientist said, no human being has ever lived on a planet this hot. The question is whether our species will be able to adapt to this new ecology, if you will. Now, if you start looking and collecting these facts, they just are coming at you from every place. More than half of the carbon exhaled into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels has been emitted in just the last 3 decades. We thought we were making progress. We're not. Now, China is a paradox. It is a leader in wind, and it's a leader in solar, but is the leading polluter, and it's a leader in coal. And we have to get an understanding of China and its relationship to this problem. It is very, very big. China is now 28 to 30% of all global emissions. The United States has come down to 15, 14 and a half. China and its relationship to coal really has to be looked at. They burn more coal in China than the US, Japan, and Europe combined. 2, 800 million people in China burn coal in their homes. 3, China is saying they're gonna peak in their emissions by 2030. We have to peak in our emissions yesterday. Okay, we have to cut emissions by 50% in 10 years. We can't peak in 10 years. But China is building and planning to build coal-fired power plants in Turkey, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Egypt, Africa, and that is a scary prospect. This is a new Chinese coal-fired power plant in Serbia. Here's one in Pakistan. Here's one in Africa. This is a map of China's financing coal power plant development across the globe. You can't be cutting emissions and be doing this. There are so many of these opposing trends that are covered in this book. It makes you just have an extreme level of cognitive dissonance. Greenhouse gas emissions have increased faster in 2018 than during any of the past 6 years. We are just not making any progress globally. When you look at extreme weather, tornadoes increased 30% over anything known in the past. This is an Oklahoma tornado in May of 2013, the largest tornado ever recorded on Earth. Its path of destruction was 2.5 miles wide. Category 5 hurricanes are becoming commonplace. They were very rare up to this point. From 2016 to 2019, there were the longest sequence of Category 5 hurricanes in Puerto Rico, in the Bahamas, in Florida. This is Abaco, Bahamas, which was hit by Category 5, and people said it looked like it was hit by a nuclear weapon. Melting and drought. In 1910, there were 150 glaciers in Montana. Now there are only 27. Glaciers are melting in the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau. This is the Rhone Valley in 1849 to your left, and the same valley in 2019. Gulp. Antarctica. The poles are warming faster than the rest of the Earth. Antarctica, since 1958, warmed by 4.4 degrees. The Earth only warmed by 1 degree. Okay, so it is twice as much as scientists predicted, and 3 times the overall rate of warming on Earth. In Antarctica, in 2015, the temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit was measured. Never seen that before in 150 years. Here's an Alaskan glacier melting over the course of 3 months. Notice the blackness of the ice. That's soot, usually from Chinese coal burning, that falls on the white snow and turns it dark and helps melting because it affects the albedo of the Earth. Now, drought is also a sign of global warming. The percentage of the Earth's surface suffering drought has doubled since 1970. This is Australia, flyover of Queensland, which used to be a very lush green area. Now it looks like the arid deserts of the Middle East. If you get to 1.5 degrees of warming, it is expected that drought will increase by a factor of 10 globally. So those areas that are dark red are the ones that will be most heavily impacted. So this is a map by NASA called The Earth on Fire, which is a cover of my book, and it diagrams all the fires on Earth in 2019. So these fires spew carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In Indonesia, where a lot of these fires are intentionally set, in 1997, there was a fire in Indonesia that covered the whole South Asia, sort of, with smoke. 2.6 billion tons of carbon was released. That was 40% of the entire average global emissions from one country's fires. In 2015, they did it again because they're cutting down and burning forests to create palm oil plantations, and the CO2 emitted was equal to the United States of America. So if you were doing something in 2015 to try to lower your carbon footprint, Indonesia just erased everything for you in that year. And they did it again in 2019, by the way. In Sydney, the fires are still burning as I speak. Smoke was so intense it set off smoke alarms in homes. The air pollution was 11 times greater than hazardous. We are in the middle of the worst drought in living memory. This is the second hottest year on record, said their environmental minister, Matt Keane. Yesterday, smoke was causing some of the worst air pollution in Sydney that we've ever seen. This is climate change. So here's Greta again on fires.
We have to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases. And either we do that or we don't. You say nothing in life is black or white, but that is a lie, a very dangerous lie. Either we prevent a 1.5 degree of warming or we don't. Either we avoid setting off that irreversible chain reaction beyond human control or we don't. Either we choose to go on as a civilization or we don't. That is as black or white as it gets. We must change almost everything in our current societies. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. Because it is.
And not only that, oceans are heating up. The rate, when oceans absorb heat, they absorb carbon dioxide and they convert it to carbonic acid. So oceans acidify with global warming. The rate of acidification is greater than it has been in 56 million years. Says Barbara Honish in Science, we are entering an unknown territory of marine ecosystem change. Now, there are also new diseases that are appearing that are related to climate change, like Zika, Eastern equine encephalitis in Michigan, West Nile, yellow fever, sandflies, SARS, MERS, and other bugs. There's also another one that's circulating now, African swine fever, which threatens to kill 25% of all the pigs in the world. It has started in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, reaching Europe, Bulgaria as we speak. There are also new diseases that are coming from melted permafrost where there are no immunities. A 32,000-year-old bacteria was revived in 2005. An 8-million-year-old bug was brought back to life in 2007. Here's a picture of a worm that was frozen for 42,000 years and reanimated. Okay, There's some real dangers out there as the permafrost melts. Now, there are other forms of destroying our planet that are only tangentially related to climate change, but they're corollaries, so let's talk about them. Take number one, population growth. We just continue growing. 74 million new people every year. That's one new Turkey or Iran added to the global picture, to the global demographic every year. As climate scientists say, more feet, more heat. They use more food, generate more trash, generate more climate change, but it's a secondary variable. This overfishing is another. What you're looking at is a satellite view of Chinese boats that have huge metal nets that sink to the bottom of the ocean and scrape the ocean floor of every living thing that's down there. Those are fleets those are mud trails that are left by scraping off every last living thing on the ocean floor. An area is scraped about the size of the United States every year. Egregiously destructive process. Plastic pollution. Microplastics are found in mussels, freshwater fish, not just on the surface of the ocean, all the way down to 1,000 meters. 73% of the fish found in the North Atlantic contain microplastics. There's a very, very big problem, deforestation. Trees soak up CO2 and release oxygen. 7 trees will generate as much oxygen as one person needs. So when you cut down a tree, not only do you stop the absorption of CO2, you stop the generation of oxygen. Deforestation is extremely harmful to the environment, and it is related to climate change. We have cut down as a species 46% of all the trees on Earth since we developed the saw. We are now every year losing 25,000 square miles of forest, roughly the size of Sri Lanka, every year. Now, Scientific American says it has an extreme effect on global warming. It adds more CO2 to the atmosphere than the total of all cars and trucks on the world's roads. Now, that's something that most people don't know. Deforestation, very big problem. Now, this first chapter is surveying all the bad news, and here's more. This was what Al Gore presented in Inconvenient Truth. They dug an ice core in Antarctic, and they looked at the bubbles in that ice core, and they go back 800,000 years, and the bubbles show how much CO2 was in the atmosphere. Well, now the CO2 level was much higher than it was for 800,000 years. Okay, Al Gore presented that in his movie, but a second study has followed up on that in the Allen Hills of Antarctica. They drilled down deeper. They went down 200 meters, pulled up an ice core that was 2 million years old, looked at the bubbles, and they said, my God, the CO2 was never above 300 parts per million. Well, we have 415 parts per million now. That means that the CO2, the carbon dioxide level today, is 38% higher than at any time in the last 2 million years. Okay, there's the graph of CO2 measured by the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. It's not turning around. It's not going down. It's going straight up. Where is my contribution to global warming? I don't see anything. I mean, I added solar panels to my house, but those CO2 numbers just keep accelerating. I don't see the results of my behavior or yours or anybody else's. So what do they talk about when they talk about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees? The Paris Accords attempted to get commitments from countries so that we would stay under 1.5 degrees, and then that we would not exceed 2 degrees by the end of this century. Well, 80% of the countries that signed those accords did not live up to their commitments, and it doesn't look like the Paris Accords have enough teeth to do much of anything at all. Now, the World Meteorological Association, I read this report in November, and I said, oh my God. So they said in November, that the temperature of the Earth increased 0.2 of a degree of centigrade in 4 years. Okay, now if you factor that in, that means we will achieve 1.5 degrees of warming in 2027. That's 7 years from now. We'll get to 2 degrees of warming by 2036. That's 16 years from now. We'll get to 3 degrees of warming by 2057. We got to do something different than what we're doing, and that includes what the Paris Accords we're talking about. This is very serious stuff. Okay? If you have children or grandchildren, and they reach retirement 30 years from now, in 2050, as we approach 3 degrees of warming, this is what the world looks like. Over 1 million species of plant and animal life will have gone extinct. There will be no tigers, pandas, rhinos, alligators, elephants, whales, red wolves, owls, polar bears, gazelles, unless you see them in zoos. There will be 200 million climate refugees by 2050, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia. Half of America's bird species will have emigrated to other climates. Most of the trees native to Europe will have gone extinct. Most coral reefs and the species they protect will be gone. There are 354 cities in the world with average maximum temperatures of 95 degrees in the summer. That will triple. The temperature in Boston will resemble Atlanta. Portland will resemble San Antonio. London will be like Madrid. Madrid will be like Marrakesh. And Marrakesh will be like no place on earth today. Miami, Shanghai, Hong Kong, the Marshall Islands, Miami Beach, Venice Beach, Jakarta, home to 10 million, will be underwater. Rising sea levels. There will be large-scale food shortages and famines. Wheat and corn prices will increase as much as 500%. Mosquitoes will be, and carrying malaria and dengue fever, will be flying through the streets of Copenhagen and Chicago. Now, this is science that I'm reporting to you. I didn't make any of this stuff up, okay? There will be 3.5 billion people impacted by malaria. Category 4 and 5 hurricanes increase 25% for every degree of warming. So if we go to 3 degrees of warming, we're going to see Category 4 and 5 hurricanes at triple the rate we have now. Schizophrenia and suicide will increase. They happen to be correlated to heat. Transitioning from 1.5 to 2 degrees, remember we have about 15 years before that's going to happen, will involve at least 150 million deaths. That's 3 World War IIs to be expected in the next 15 years. So you say, okay, I've had enough. Thanks, Jerry, but I don't want to hear any more. I don't want any more bad news. Are you done? And the answer is no, I'm not done. There is more. And it's even worse. It's called feedback amplification loops, the tipping points of no return. There are processes that are going to get out of control if we don't do something. A tipping point meaning, here's your variable A, when it influences variable B, which influences variable C, which comes back to influence variable A. A vicious circle is generated, and this has nothing anymore to do with human inputs. Here's our first feedback loop. Global warming melts the polar ice caps, which makes it less white, which reflects less sunlight, which absorbs more heat, which melts more permafrost, which releases more CO2, which releases more methane, which releases more warming, and the process keeps going on. The permafrost contains 1.8 trillion tons of carbon, twice as much as currently in the atmosphere. It's frozen in the ground. If that melts, it's released. Okay, when it's released, global warming increases. Here's a Russian video of poking a hole in the permafrost and releasing methane.
Держи факел, держи факел. Кисней подбей. Только аккуратно.
Scary. So here's how the feedback loop looks. Global warming produces Arctic ice melting, which changes the albedo of the Earth. That helps to turn the Arctic Ocean blue, and melting permafrost is a result. Methane released, higher levels of methane and CO2 get in the atmosphere, and that's more global warming. And we don't need to, humans can just be gone, and this process will continue. That's the North Pole in 1979. That's the North Pole in 2003. And when I saw this last picture, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no ice cap at the North Pole. 2019, I said, this has got to be photoshopped. I couldn't believe this. Didn't want to believe it. Tried to vet that photograph. Couldn't be sure. So I said, the hell with it. And I went for this picture by NASA, 1984, 2016. Obviously, you see melting, okay? Obviously, the albedo of the Earth is changing. Second feedback loop. Global warming produces drought. Drought produces fire. Fire releases CO2. CO2 increases warming. Another feedback loop. Peatlands, Indonesia and Malaysia, soggy soil, hold 5 times more carbon than forests do. When they burn, they release a lot of carbon. One study showed that 40% of the peatlands in Indonesia were drier than they have been in 1,000 years. 24% were drier than they had been in 2,000 years. So again, that feedback loop. Global warming produces drought. Drought dries things up. Wildfires emerge. They release CO2. And here we have more warming. The third feedback loop has to do with the oceans. CO2 is absorbed by the oceans. Oceans acidify. As they acidify, they absorb less CO2. And as they absorb less CO2, that goes into the atmosphere and creates more warming. Here's a short video explaining what I've just tried to explain.
About us avoiding going over a 2-degree rise in the temperature of the planet. Why are they so worried about that? If we go over that amount of warming, there are feedback loops in our ecosystems, tipping points that climate change could spin out of control, and it happens like that.
There are switches that can be tripped where suddenly you are in brand new territory and you don't even begin to know what to do about it. This is not a linear kind of problem that we're dealing with. This is very much an exponential kind of problem.
Right now, we're on the edge of 3 major tipping points. The first one is the Arctic ice cap. That ice cap's like a mirror. It reflects the sun's light off of the Earth and keeps it from warming us up. But as it melts, you get a smaller mirror, which means a warmer Earth, which means more melting, which means more climate change. Another example is Arctic methane. We've got a gigantic amount of methane gas frozen into the tundra. And it is 50 times as toxic as CO2 is. It's CO2 on steroids. As it warms, and that methane gets released, it then causes global warming to get worse, which means it warms more, which means more methane released, which means worse warming, and all of that process spins out of control. Another example of a tipping point is ocean acidification. As you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, a lot of it actually is going into our oceans. And a lot of stuff, like plankton, can't live in that kind of acidified water. And plankton is the basis of the food chain. If the plankton die, we lose the whole ocean ecosystem.
These kinds of feedback loops and tipping points are what keep me up at night, that we will hit one before we're able to turn things around.
Even if we went cold turkey today because of the time lags in our climate system, we've already signed up for things that we can't see yet.
It's not about a few more droughts and a few more storms. It's about a catastrophic shift in this fragile balance of our biosphere that threatens everything we love.
So scientists can't really estimate. When I showed you that graph of ppm of CO2 going up, that's a linear graph, and scientists estimate that it's increasing 2 parts per million every year. That's the rate. But when it goes from linear to exponential, that's when we lose predictive power. We don't know just how fast those changes are going to happen. Well, the question is when is the point of no return? And while there's some disagreement among scientists, I got a source, Vivan Sorab, in the Yale Environmental Review, sounded like a good vetted source to me. Point of no return will arrive in the year 2035. Well, that gives us 15 years from the date of this YouTube video. Okay, so we're on notice, aren't we? Yeah.
And the point of no return is no longer over the horizon. It is in sight and hurtling towards us.
It's, by the way, I'm stopping now. This is the end of the bad news. I presented it. It's scary. It is catastrophic. It is apocalyptic. But there's another part of this book that's called Hope and Action. And here is where some of the good news starts. So we will begin this with Greta.
Now we're almost at the end of my talk. And this is where people usually start talking about hope. Solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talking and selling positive ideas. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because if it would have, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. Today, we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can't save the world by playing by the rules, because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change, and it has to start today. Thank you.
Greta speaks in very, very simple declarative sentences, and each one of them is stunningly true. So if we look at who's to blame, the latest data shows that China is producing 28% of global emissions. The US 15, now it's 14.5. EU about 9.5, Russia 5, India 6. And of these gases, 76% CO2, but 16% is methane. Now, here's the issue. The consensus of scientists is that we must cut emissions at least 50%. Some say 80%, some say 100, but we should cut it 50 by 2030. That's 10 years from now. If you look at these graphs, on your left is methane. It's just going straight up. You look at CO2 on your right, it's not bending, it's not turning around and going around. We have a major problem. We are not making any progress at all, and we have 10 years to cut it 50%. That's the challenge. So there are two groups of solutions, conventional and unconventional. There's a book called Drawdown, written by about 130 scientifically minded people, listing about 89 methods for bringing down CO2. It's a very interesting, important book. I use it in my own research. So we can classify approaches to turning this graph down to 50% in terms of conventional and unconventional remedies. And I would like to talk about both in this section. And they're all very important. So let's take a look at conventional number one, solar panel. Burning fossil fuels constitutes 92% of all greenhouse gases. If we could stop, we could bring emissions down by 92%. Solar panels have dropped in price 80% in the last decade. The cost of a solar farm over its lifetime is less than building a coal-fired power plant today. So how many do we need? Well, we need 21,000 square miles of solar panels to power the United States. We need 191,000 square miles of solar panels to power the world. But that's the bad news. The good news is that if we're shooting for a 50% reduction, we only need 95,000 square miles of solar panels to get a 50% reduction. That's about half the size of Spain. And that's not a US project, that's a global planetary project that we have to engage in the next 10 years and have completed. Now, that's pretty good news. If you look at this plan for the United States, this blue square represents the area of the United States where we would have to build out solar infrastructure. That would replace all fossil fuel burning in the United States. That's a pretty attractive proposal, but it's still quite theoretical, is it not? This large square in the Sahara Desert would be big enough to power the entire world. The second square would be big enough to power the entire European Union. Now, it's not just solar power. Wind power, too, is extremely inexpensive. Wind turbines are cheaper than coal, natural gas, and nuclear as I speak. And offshore turbines are 70% more efficient than land wind turbines. Altogether, how many would you need? Well, you'd need 4 million to power the world. And remember, in equatorial countries, the wind is not as strong as it does elsewhere. So wind might not work well in those regions. But if we said we only need half that many to get a 50% reduction, then we would need 2 million wind turbines. That's still doable. Here are two leaders of the climate movement, Al Gore, Ocasio-Cortez. One is more conventional, one is more radical. I would like to just introduce them. Both of them talk about the relationship between this problem and the mobilization for World War II.
The economic historians remind us that even though we give FDR and the New Deal the credit for ending the Great Depression, what really ended it was World War II, when we mobilized for a great national effort in which the survival of our country and our values was deemed to be at stake. And when we decided to act, then we put people to work and the economy started booming like never before. Well, this time the threat is different, and it doesn't trigger the ancient reflexes we inherited from our ancestors when they were attacked by other humans with weapons, but it is nonetheless a threat to our survival. This stuff is no joke.
That come after us are looking up, and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war. This is our World War II.
So, speaking of World War II, a really brilliant environmentalist named Lester Brown made the analogy and said that, you know, there are no 1943 Chevrolets. There are no 1944 Buicks. The president ordered the automobile industry to shut down and retool and make tanks and aircraft. In the space of like 3 years, the United States built 50,000 tanks, 256,000 airplanes, and ships. So the entire economy was converted to a war footing in just a very few years. That's the kind of mobilization we need in this country and in the world. And when you talk about 91,000 square miles of solar panels or 2 million wind turbines, replacing all of the fossil fuel infrastructure on this planet in 10 years, that is a huge, huge undertaking. But it's not impossible. We did the equivalent in World War II. So there are other conventional remedies that people talk about. Carbon taxes, they work. Paul Krugman talks about the value of carbon taxes. However, they were tried in France, and the Yellow Vest movement was born, and they were tried in Australia, and there were protests. It's not that easy to simply impose carbon taxes. Another approach is conservation. You could get almost 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by intensifying conservation efforts worldwide. But you have to remember that 60% of the planet makes less than $5 a day. So when you ask someone at Starbucks in California to stop using plastic straws, that's one thing. But when you start thinking about imposing conservation rules on the rest of the planet, it's not quite as easy and simple as it might sound. Now let's take a look at rationing and more unconventional radical remedies which are espoused in this book. Okay, here's where we get some teeth into these recommendations. Rationing was used in World War II. You could only buy so much sugar or gasoline. All right, you had a ration book. Now, very few people in the United States even talk about rationing, but it's an extremely effective way of enforcing conservation, which spares the poor. I'll explain in a second. Take a look at beef. Beef, cows that is, produce 14% of global emissions. All right, here's a short video on the role of that.
And after this, we collect inside the bag.
So how long has that bag been collecting gas?
Only 2 hours.
Methane is something like 22 times more potent as a climate-changing gas than is CO2. So it doesn't take very much methane to make a difference.
A cow can basically fill up a 55-gallon garbage bag full of methane every day. One cow's not a problem, but now we have 1.5 billion of them. And it's an incredibly inefficient way of producing food. 3/4 of agricultural land is used just to feed livestock. When you factor in everything, the clearing of the land for grazing, feeding, transporting, livestock causes more greenhouse gases than all the direct emissions from the entire transportation sector.
I don't think it's a...
So, beef, not lamb, poultry, turkey, other things, beef, cows produce huge amounts of methane, which is an extremely toxic greenhouse gas. The major contributors to this pollution, beef eaters, US, Canada, Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand. So, the average American eats roughly 800 hamburgers a year. It's fourth in the world in beef consumption. Japan 28th, China 47th. If Americans, now you could say, okay, well, let's charge more for beef and let's double the price. Well, that hurts the poor, and it does cut down on beef consumption. But rationing is fairer because people who can't afford to eat expensive steaks still have an access to beef. With a 50% rationing, let's say that you could only purchase so many pounds of beef per month, like it was World War II. Well, that would reduce America's ability to eat hamburgers to 1 hamburger a day. Okay? That wouldn't be that severe, and it wouldn't impact the poor that much. If you cut beef consumption worldwide by half, it would cause a 7% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's a thought. Here's another one, rationing electricity. Electricity generates 25% of global emissions. Cut it in half, you save 12.5% of that 50% target. The average home in the United States in the 70s was like 1,400 square feet. Same size family, but now it's like 2,600 square feet. Okay? Now, that's an average size home to your left, and that's an upscale home to your right. If you rationed electricity and said, like in World War II, you're only allowed 911 kilowatt hours of electricity per month. After that, we shut off your electricity. Well, it wouldn't hurt the poor because that's how much they use anyway. It wouldn't hurt the middle class, most of them, because that's how much they use anyway. But the upper class and the wealthier segments of society would have to, they got 4 flat screen TVs, 3 air conditioners, a swimming pool pump, and a hot tub pump. Well, they'd probably have to shut all of that off and just use 1 flat screen TV. Otherwise, their house would go dark by the end of the month. This is another approach to rationing on Los Angeles freeway on Thanksgiving. Americans burn 391 million gallons of gasoline every single day. Cars and trucks account for 20% of U.S. emissions. It's an awful lot of traffic there. The average car on the road gets 24 miles per gallon. The average truck, 13 to 18 miles per gallon. The average 18-wheeler gets 6 miles per gallon. Okay, how are we going to cut this in half? Well, globally, 93 million barrels of oil are burned every day. A billion cars are on the road today, and 83 million new cars are added to this equation every single year. Transportation accounts for 14% of all emissions. So how do you cut it in half in 10 years? Well, Paul Krugman is suggested increasing the price of gasoline by $1 a gallon. Can you name many politicians in the United States who are talking about increasing the price of gasoline for global warming purposes? Certainly not many. If you increase the price of diesel fuel 66 cents a gallon, that would have a major effect on moving freight in the United States. I'll explain that. It's explained in the book. How do you remove cars, though? The average car on the road today on Earth is 11 years old. So we need to get these cars off the road, and we need to get twice the fuel efficiency that we have now. If you want to cut transportation emissions, you got to go from 24 miles a gallon to 50. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, there are 13 cars today that get over 50 miles a gallon, and by the year 2025, they expect to have 120 models that'll get 50 miles a gallon. We need to change the Earth's global transportation auto fleet in the next 10 years. We need to revise it entirely. Here are cars that get way more than 50 miles a gallon that you can buy today. We own Chevrolet Bolts. I get over 100 miles a gallon with my all-electric Chevrolet Bolt. So there's the Tesla, the Volt, the Kia Soul. Now, if there was a law in the United States that said that no cars could be manufactured, imported, or exported with less than 50 miles per gallon in 8 years, that seems to be reasonable. That seems like we could almost pass that kind of legislation. Belgium already has passed a law saying you've got to get 50 miles a gallon or you can't be on roads in Belgium. We also have to remove existing cars and incentivize people to buy them. In California, there's a current law that says if you take your car and convert it to an electric car or a hybrid and take your old car to a junkyard and have it crushed, we'll pay you $1,000. Okay, so that's a process in California of destroying and getting cars off the road that are gas guzzlers. Another issue is switching from trucking to rail. Truckers don't like it. The rail industry really does. Rail transport is 11 times more efficient than taking one of those 18-wheelers across the country. Here's another way of cutting emissions. Airlines. They represent 3% of all global emissions, and the most traveled country in the world are Americans. 70%, however, this is a BBC study, an English study, 70% of all flights were taken by the wealthiest 15% of the population. So most flights are really kind of luxury travel rather than necessities. Americans, on average, travel 3,000 miles per year. All right? Now, rationing air travel, you're no more frequent flyer miles. All right? That's done, over and done with. But you have an allotment that you can travel 3,000 miles a year on airplanes. That would cut emissions for Americans by half. And if you had similar rationing plans globally, you could shave off 1.5% of global emissions. So we've been talking about these more unconventional remedies. How are we doing? Well, we've suggested wind and solar at a 50% level, 2 million wind turbines. We could get 45% reductions using a massive, massive global effort to build up solar and wind infrastructure. If we'd engaged in global rationing of beef, electricity, transportation, we'd save another chunk. Altogether, just these remedies would save 71%. Now, there are many more remedies discussed in my book. I'm giving you just a sample, but it's quite obvious we have the technology And we could do it. Now, in the pipeline, there are at least 20 other promising technologies. They're not ready to come to market yet, but they're promising, and they offer some very interesting ideas. One, nuclear fusion. Not there yet, but it might be there in 20 or 30 years. Getting hydrogen from seawater, using fuel cell technology from Bloom Energies. China is thinking of powering the Earth using solar from in space. Cool roofs, painting a roof white so it increases the albedo of the Earth. Alternative cement. Cement represents 5% of all global emissions. Hyperloops, Elon Musk could have a very big impact on reducing air travel. Algae biofuel, a new aluminum air battery that can get 1,500 miles on a charge. All these are promising technologies that may turn out to be viable within the next decade. We can't take those to the bank yet, but they are certainly promising. Now, there's another problem in all of this that needs to be addressed. There's a difference between cutting emissions and preventing future emissions. Some emissions can be cut, but others are baked in, and we have to stop the future baked-in emissions. They come from three major sources. Deforestation is the first one, okay? So in 2018, we cut down as many trees the size of Belgium. Now, we have to stop doing that. When you cut down those trees, they stop absorbing CO2, which puts more CO2 into the atmosphere. We have to stop deforestation in Peru, Bolivia, the Amazon, South America, generally Indonesia, Malaysia, our own country, and Canada and Russia. And there are other places, but we have to stop it. And we have to find a way to put an end to deforestation. Okay. The second is population growth. And we don't have many plans to deal with that, but the rise of 73 million new persons on Earth per year is going to build up CO2 levels. More feet, more heat. So how do you stop that? We have to have a global plan for contraception. Probably the most widely talked about in the environmental movement is the contraceptive implant. It lasts for 3 years. It's relatively inexpensive. It's very popular in Africa. As many as 200 million people would be candidates for this. And certainly one of the biggest problems we're facing as we speak are wildfires. They are 5 times more frequent this year than they were last year. They release CO2. We have to stop the wildfires. We have to have ways to stop the wildfires. Can't just let them burn because they're too far away to send tankers there. We have to do something far bigger than we have done to put an end to wildfires. So there are more radical solutions that are necessary, and I'm about ready to introduce them. But before I do, here's a professor, Jim Bendel, professor of sustainability leadership. Climate change is now a planetary emergency posing an existential threat to humanity. There will be a near-term collapse in society with serious ramifications. Catastrophe is probable. Extinction is possible. Okay? These are very, very strong words. Bill McGibbon, environmentalist. If we don't act quickly and on a global scale, then the problem will literally become insoluble. Angela Merkel got all dressed up on New Year's Eve to talk to her people. I thought, and everybody else thought she was going to say Happy New Year. No, she said climate change is a very real, dangerous prospect for everybody. This is a very serious matter. 11,000 scientists signed a declaration saying climate change was a catastrophic threat to humanity. This was in November, 2 months ago. All right, 11,000 scientists. Some people are very upset. We are on the cusp of something horrific, okay? And we have to consider radical solutions. So here are a few more. I've got 4 here. They're not talked about a lot. Only a few people talk about them, but they're worth considering. First, the occupation of the Amazon basin. What? Huh? What are you suggesting? Okay. Harvard professor Stephen Walt said, "It is only a matter of time until major powers try to stop climate change by any means necessary." The right-wing President Bolsonaro has just cut down 6,000 square miles of forest in the Amazon and 78,000 fires, many of which were intentionally set, are raging. Someone has to step in and stop this, okay? Instead of making pleas or threatening sanctions.
Way to clear land. And in August 2019, over 30,000 fires were burning in the Amazon. 3 times as many as August 2018. Many set illegally by ranchers, farmers, and landowners, emboldened by the government's new stance on the Amazon. But this time, the Amazon is unlikely to survive another wave of deforestation.
So there's a scientific study that just came out that said Amazon itself is reaching a tipping point. If you cut down much more of it, the rest of it will be impacted, and it will turn into a savanna. So the Amazon is reaching its own private little tipping point as we speak. We have to stop this. The same is true with the deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia for the purposes of making palm oil. The fires in Indonesia spewed enough CO2 as all of the emissions of Japan in 1 year. In another, there were 3 major fires, 1997, 2015, and now. And the second fire created as much CO2 as all of the emissions of the United States. The third fire, which is still ongoing to some extent, spewed as much CO2 as the entire country of Canada. So how do we stop this? A president said, "I'm sorry, I wish we didn't do it," but the president is involved with the capitalist interests who are involved in palm oil production. The Indonesian fires emitted double the carbon of Amazon fires this year. That's November 2019.
There's a good chance you're not familiar with it, even though you'll find it in many of the products you use every day. It's in everything, from makeup and toothpaste to donuts, chocolate bars, and in some countries, biodiesel fuel. It goes by many names, but it's most commonly known as palm oil. Global consumption of palm oil has quintupled since 1990. Oil derived from the palm fruit is easy to extract, has a higher yield than other types of vegetable oils, and can be used in dozens of products. But the proliferation of palm oil also poses a massive environmental threat. Each year, palm oil plantations destroy millions of acres of forested land, create billions of tons of carbon pollution, and kill endangered wildlife. All of this makes the palm oil industry one of the worst environmental offenders on the planet. In 2015, over 62,000 square miles around the world, much of it former forests, were committed to palm oil plantations. That's an area 4 times the size of Switzerland. Palm oil is one of the top 3 drivers of deforestation in Indonesia, a country that supplies more than half of global demand. Each year in Indonesia, fires are set to clear forested lands to make way for palm oil production. Just last year, over 10,000 square miles were torched, creating fires so big they could be seen from outer space. All of this unleashes massive amounts of carbon into the air. Fires in 2015 added more than 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So the suggestion is a UN occupation of not the entire country of Brazil or Indonesia, but of the Amazon basin in Brazil, and making it a permanent protectorate in which all commercial activity in the Amazon is stopped. No soybean, no cattle, no mining, and reforest the area. Same is true with Indonesia. The provinces, 2 or 3 provinces of Indonesia and Malaysia, are occupied by UN military activity and forced to shut down and reforest the area. These are severe measures, but we're now fighting. The United States is currently at war in what, 8 countries? None of them have anything to do with climate change, or terrorism, or hegemony, but this is a plan to occupy by force these areas to shut them down because they are an imminent threat to the human race. And while the purpose, of course, is to stop the fires, mainly. That is the most immediate purpose. But while we're at it, we need to begin the process of reforesting 120,000 square miles of the Amazon and 72,000 square miles of Malaysia. It takes 6 to 10 years for trees to get to sufficient maturity that they begin starting to absorb CO2. We have to start this process now if we want to get to some kind of goal within 10 years. There's another radical approach, but a little more appealing for you possibly, and that is dealing with the wildfires. Developing wildfire response teams. There are 72,000 fires in Malaysia this year, 78,000 fires in the Amazon alone. Something like 2 million acres were burned in the Amazon this year. And there were also fires in Alaska and Siberia and Canada, which couldn't be accessed because they're too far away from normal firefighting capabilities. You can have helicopters carry 3,000 gallons of water and fire retardant a couple hundred miles, but these fires are many hundreds of miles away. Well, Dmitry Medvedev in Russia said, we just can't reach these fires. They're too far away. The United States has 13 supertankers. They can fly 4,000 miles and carry 20,000 gallons of water and fire retardant. They can reach these areas. Bolivia rented one to fight its fires. Okay, it couldn't afford to rent more. So if there were 100 supertankers like the 747 and the Russian Ilyushin 76, both of which have a very huge reach, 4,000 miles, 2,000 miles there and back, the human race could begin the process of putting out these fires so that they do not rage across Australia and Siberia and Canada the way they did this year. It is an emergency measure that has to really be considered. 100 staging supertankers, 18 staging areas across the world. We would have an impact on these fires. We really would. They do work. So as we're speaking, there have been fires raging in Australia. 25 million acres have burned, an area the size of South Korea, and they're still burning. So there are petitions circulating in Australia to collect money to buy supertankers. So obviously this is not just a frivolous idea. If there were a fleet of supertankers that could address the huge global planetary fires that are raging, we could possibly make an impact at putting them out. A fourth controversial recommendation is banning fracking. We thought that fracking was going to give us plentiful natural gas, and it was celebrated. We thought we would eliminate our coal industries and convert them to natural gas. But as time wore on, we looked at this graph of methane, and it leveled off in 2000, then it started shooting up again. It shot up primarily because of the United States fracking industry. Almost 80% of the increase in methane production in the last 20 years is due to American fracking operations. The fracking industry said we'll take care of the methane problem, but they have not. It is important to ban fracking now.
I don't have to explain to anyone here that the growing body of evidence tells us that fracking is a danger to our water supply, our most precious resource. And it is contributing to climate change.
So those are just some of the controversial recommendations. So how much is this going to cost? Well, Joe Biden's plan is $1.7 trillion. Kirsten Gillibrand, running as a Democratic candidate, I think she dropped out already. Her plan was $10 trillion. Elizabeth Warren, $3 trillion. Morgan Stanley, the bank, estimated $50 trillion by 2050. Bernie Sanders' plan, I think, is a little more reasonable. 16 trillion, Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal, between 2.5 and 36 trillion, depending on who is looking at it. But these plans are amazingly guilty of being American-centric. They hardly even talk about the outside world. We are 14%. If we cut down 7%, we still have 43% of global emissions to deal with. So this plan presented here is a $25 trillion global plan involving the costs to all countries of the world. It's approximately $1.28 trillion annually. It would cost the American taxpayer $600 per taxpayer, and it would also involve cutting defense, about 50%. Okay, so what's it all about, Alfie? How does this all factor out? Well, the major conclusion is that hope is rational. We know the problem. We have the technology to solve it. It is not financially impossible to address. We just need to get started, and we need to get started yesterday. If we're going to meet a 1.5 degree of warming criterion and keep it under that in 10 years, we have to get started right away. Now, just before finishing this, there are two more things I need to tell you, and there's more bad news and a little bit of good news. The bad news is that we are misunderstanding who the climate change deniers are. We think of them as people who are scientifically illiterate, or people who are extreme Republicans, or people who watch Fox News religiously. They are not. They are very intelligent people. They're from the business community. They are hedge fund managers, people who watch Jim Cramer, CNBC, Bloomberg, read the Wall Street Journal. These are the people who are living in a fantasy world. Okay? These are the people who are really in denial about what is going on. Now I'm going to cite some climate change, I call it climate change pornography. So get ready. All right, fracking is expected to increase 3.6% every year until 2030. And that's celebrated by Wall Street. Oh my gosh, look at that growth. Well, does that mean that methane is going to continue to go up every single year for the next 10 years? Gentlemen, ladies, plastics production will grow 40% by 2030. Really? The U.S. oil production will increase 46% by 2030. Chief economist of ConocoPhillips, Helen Curry, says U.S. oil exports will increase 50%. Helen, my question is, what asylum are you living in where you would say something like that without even blushing? The UN says there will be a 150% increase in coal output by 2030. Steel production will increase by 60% by 2030. The American trucking industry is happy to report that it foresees a 25% increase in trucking demand by 2030. Even though the average SUV gets only 22 miles a gallon, they expect SUV sales to double by 2030. Are you getting a feeling of cognitive dissonance here? I mean, we are supposed to be reducing CO2 emissions by 50% in 10 years. Somebody is off. Somebody is in la-la land, okay? And if all of this science is incorrect, then we're in la-la land. But if all of this science is correct, then that community that is so happy about those statistics is crazy. Here's a little more global warming porn. China will export a dozen newly built coal-fired plants into Africa before 2030, nearly equal in output to the entire coal power capacity of the European Union within the next few years. Beef production will increase 37% in the next decade. The global demand for cheese will increase 2.2% every year. Milk production will increase 35% between now and 2030. Palm oil will increase sixfold by 2030. That means they're going to, what, cut down 6 times more forests and create palm oil plantations. More oil, more gas, more fracking, more steel, more coal, more trucking, more beef, more SUVs, more palm oil, more cheese, more dairy. Nobody in that sector of the world seems to be listening. Wall Street, average salary for Wall Street financial people is $400,000 per year, which means, baby, this party is not going to end anytime soon. So Greta visited the business community, and they asked her, what do you have to say? Well, she gave them a piece of her mind.
What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences.
So Jane Fonda said, I beg people to ratchet up their action on climate. This is it, folks. This is the time. She's 82 years old, just arrested in protests. Protests sprung up throughout the fall of 2019 everywhere. 6 million people participated. Greta was certainly up there leading the charge.
We are unstoppable. A better world is possible. We are unstoppable. A better world is possible. We are unstoppable. A better world is possible.
I was stunned by a few headlines. Scientists endorse mass civil disobedience to force climate action. Scientists are not usually people who endorse civil disobedience. I mean, when you talk about civil disobedience, you're talking about Extinction Rebellion, flying drones into Heathrow Airport trying to stop air travel. That's civil disobedience. Here we have 400 scientists endorsing that. It's serious, okay? I see a headline in The Guardian, civil disobedience is the only way left to fight climate change. That depressed me. It made me unhappy. I was very, very disturbed by that. Is that all there is? Is that all we have? I went to sleep sometime in October or November, and it was like an archangel came to me in the middle of the night, blowing a trumpet, saying, yes, there is another answer. And the answer was that the President of the United States, the most powerful country on earth, declares a national emergency and invokes presidential emergency powers. I thought, wow, wouldn't that be something? But you think emergency powers. Wait a second, that's George Bush and the Patriot Act and bugging everybody's emails and telephone calls, or Barack Obama's emergency powers and starting to invade countries in Africa and Libya and Yemen, and then there's Trump and his emergency powers and building the wall. So they don't seem to have a lot of cachet from the point of view of someone who's interested in climate change, but I decided to write to a professor of environmental law in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I thought this was an original idea. And he said, no, it's not an original idea. Other people have thought of it, and it is a good idea in the hands of the right progressive president. The powers are formidable. So watch. This is the good news for this talk. I know that there's a reflex reaction against this, but if you invoke presidential emergency powers and you're interested in climate change, first of all, there's $6 billion spent on lobbyists in this country. That's about $10 million for every senator and congressman. And the president invoking those powers would have some degree of protection against all these lobbies, the beef lobby, the oil and gas lobby, the fracking lobby, the dairy lobby, the auto lobby, the trucking lobby. The president would have an ability to just push those lobbyists aside. If you want to build wind and solar systems to replace fossil fuels, you want to put wind turbines across Texas and Oklahoma and Nebraska, you need permission, you need permits. Counties and states and cities have to sign off on permits to allow you to have those transmission lines. Presidential emergency powers just cuts right through all of that. Okay? The president has the power to shut down the internet. The president has the power to ration supplies. And foreign trade, the powers of the presidency are enormous when it comes to trade embargoes, sanctions, tariffs. Here's the Barbie doll problem. After all, we have to deal with China, and we cannot go to war. But we do have to stop China. How do you stop China? Well, here's a good example, the Barbie doll problem. Here's Barbie. She is made in a city in China, and that city, that to your lower left, is powered by 6 coal-fired power plants that spew soot into the atmosphere, ends up in Alaska, melts the glaciers, and so forth. All right? Now, Barbie gets on a diesel truck. There are 10 million diesel trucks in China. They spew black carbon. The diesel fuel in China is much dirtier than in the West. And then Barbie gets to port and gets on a ship which emits sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, where she comes to the port of Oakland or port of Long Beach and is offloaded and goes directly to Walmart or Target or Macy's. Mattel says that one Barbie is sold every 3 seconds in the United States. So here's what the president could do. Under emergency powers, the president could say, you've got 3 years, China, but in 3 years' time, the United States will not import any products that are made from coal-fired sources. Any manufacturing that comes from coal-fired plants will not be allowed into the United States. That's $600 billion in trade every year. So China would have 3 years to convert its coal-fired plants to natural gas or solar or renewables. But if China said, okay, well, forget about America, we'll sell Barbie to Mexico. No, the president can say, we will not do any trade with Mexico either if Mexico trades with countries that use coal-fired power plants. Now, there have been countries like France that's already considering that kind of legislation. This is a powerful, powerful remedy. Declaring a national emergency and presidential emergency powers has been suggested by 3 possible candidates: Bernie Sanders, Tom Steyer, Michael Bloomberg. Great. They're very American-centric. They're not talking about China, but at least they're on the right track. I wish Elizabeth Warren was in this group, but there's only 3 so far.
I would declare a state of emergency on climate on day 1. I think we have to, because I think it is a state of emergency. We have to deal with it immediately.
So, concluding, what can I do? Well, a number of authors have said you need to put personal, what do they call it? Performances of moral purity to the side. Whether you're a vegan or you live an ethical lifestyle, those personal issues, they're admirable, but political action is where we have to put all of our energies, okay? Aggressive political action between now and November of 2020. So, We have to recognize that 2020 is the most important election in our lives. If we're going to save the climate and prevent extinction of the human race, we need to get started. There are only 3 candidates that I see. I wish I could list more. Okay, but we need to get one of these folks elected, and hopefully somebody else will join in. And if that fails, if Trump is reelected, the chances that we will hit 1.5 degrees of warming are enormous. And that means the chances we will reach 2 degrees of warming and tipping points which will be breached is more than probable. Remember that if you get to 2 degrees of warming, 150 million people are expected to die. That's 3 World War IIs within the next 15 to 16 years. That's what we face. We have 15 years to prevent that, but if we fail to change our present course in 2020, we will have less time than that. So what can I do besides that? Personally, okay, 1, you can boycott Walmart, Target, Macy's made in China products, beginning now. You can change your car to get double the gas mileage if you're at 24 miles a gallon. You need 50 miles a gallon. Retire your old car. That doesn't mean sell it so someone else can drive it. It means retire it and get another car that gets you that kind of mileage. Try e-bikes, try ride sharing, try no cars, live in a city. Travel by air only 3,000 miles a year. That should be a goal. Reduce overall consumption. Flush 3 times less per day. Stop burning wood in your fireplace. Recycle paper and aluminum, most important. Stop plastic pollution and buying water bottles with 90% of those bottles end up in landfills where they degrade over the course of 450 years. Stop all beef. There are other things to eat. Cut back dairy. There's oat milk and almond milk and cashew milk and soy milk. Reduce electricity by 50% over time, not immediately. Contribute to the International Planned Parenthood Fund. Those are things that you can do personally. And if you have the money, put solar panels on your house. Charge your EV from the sun. Install a Tesla Powerwall battery. That would really reduce your carbon footprint. What else can you do? Buy this book, Ecocide, and gift it to a friend. It's an important book. Inform your friends about this video. Tell them to download it before it's taken down or censored, because you don't know what's going to happen with YouTube. Spread the word. Now, I would like to conclude this talk with Greta and have her give the final word. I want to thank you very much for watching and listening, and I hope this message gets through. Here's Greta to conclude.
Hi everyone, my name is Greta Thunberg. I am a 16-year-old climate activist from Sweden. I am grateful for being with you here in the USA, a nation that to many is the country of dreams. I also have a dream. I have a dream that people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. So then I could go home to my sister Beata and my dogs, because I miss them. In fact, I have many dreams. But this is the year 2019. This is not the time and place for dreams. This is the time to wake up. This is the moment in history we need to be wide awake. And yet, wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales, business leaders, elected officials, all across the political spectrum, spending their time making up and telling bedtime stories that soothe us, that make us go back to sleep. These are feel-good stories about how we are going to fix everything and how wonderful everything is going to be when we have solved everything. But it is time to face the reality, the facts, the science. And the science doesn't mainly speak of great opportunities to create the society we always wanted. It tells of unspoken human sufferings, which will get worse and worse the longer we delay action. Stop telling people that everything will be fine, when in fact, as it looks now, it won't be very fine. Some of you may have heard that we have 12 years as from January 1st, 2018 to cut our emissions of carbon dioxide in half. But I guess that hardly any of you have heard that is for a 50% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. 50% chance. So a 50% chance, a statistical flip of a coin. Would any one of you step onto a plane if you knew it had a 50% chance of crashing? More to the point, would you put your children on that flight?